Thank you. You may be seated. I want you this morning, by an eye of faith, to travel with me to an upper room or an upper chamber in the city of Jerusalem. It's the first century. And there in this upper room in Jerusalem, there's a group of men who are seated around a table. And these men have celebrated a feast together. In fact, to be sure, it was the feast of the Passover. It was a Jewish festival. But as you look around the room at the faces of those men, you see a certain sadness on their faces. There's a gloom that fills the air, because you see their leader, who is sitting there among them, has told them that he's going away. He's told them that one of their own number seated around that table is a traitor. One who is sitting there with them, one who is eating with them, has sold their leader out to his enemies. Jesus' eyes looked around the room, and his eyes landed on Peter. Probably the most outstanding of all the disciples. To be sure, no one ever rose higher or sank lower than Peter ever did. And Jesus looked at Peter and he told Peter, he said, "Peter, the devil has desired you. He wants to sift you as wheat, Peter. But I've prayed for you, Peter, that your faith doesn't fail you." Well, now let's leave that scene of sadness and gloom in that upper chamber in Jerusalem. And let's go to another scene. And this scene is also a scene of sadness and melancholy. You see, in this scene, Jesus has already been betrayed by Judas. Jesus has already been crucified on Calvary's hill. He's been buried in the borrowed tomb that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. The betrayal, the crucifixion, the burial of Jesus, those have left their gloomy, baneful, disconsolate effect written on the faces of those men as deep as the shadows of midnight. Just a few days earlier, on their faces was the light of hope. A light of hope that was as bright as the morning sun. But now that Jesus is dead, their world is so gray and so bleak. It's like a cold day in January when the sun's not shining. God has departed. And they stood helpless at the edge of this dark abyss, the darkest abyss that was imaginable. They are utterly dejected, and they have been attacked by the demon of despondency. They are disheartened, discouraged, and they are crestfallen. And think about that. What can be more deadly? And what can be more aggressive than despondency, discouragement, and depression? Go back into the long ago, and discouragement and depression sunk their fangs into Moses. It submerged Job into the ashes. It foiled the life of David. It sent Elijah to the cave. It chilled the soul of John the Baptist, and it turned Peter into a cursing denier of Jesus. And our text this morning finds the disciples of Jesus in the vice-like grip of depression and despondency and despair. Their words are literally the language of despair. Here's how Dr. Luke records it. It's in Luke chapter 24 and verse 21. Jesus is walking with two of his disciples on the road to Emmaus. And they said, But we trusted that it had been key which would have redeemed Israel. And besides all this, today is the third day since these things were done. My friends, those disciples had a good reason to be dejected. And they had a good reason to be discouraged. They had a good reason to be despondent and crestfallen. Jesus has been crucified. Jesus has been put to death, and their vision for a brighter and better world had vanished. 3 years earlier, these men had left their former life behind because they saw in Jesus the dawning of a new day. They saw in Jesus the herald of a better world. And in Jesus they envisioned a world with rays of light, a world that had been enveloped in darkness. They'd been captivated, mesmerized by the personality, the purposes, the power, and the miracles of Jesus Christ. Peter, Andrew, James, John, they had left their fishing boats. Matthew had abandoned his seat at the house of customs as a tax collector. Now these men were not saints as we would refer to them. And they weren't scholars. They were just ordinary men. They were made out of flesh and blood and bone and sinew. They were made out of the same kind of stuff that you and I are made of. But for 3 thrilling and exciting years, they had followed Jesus. And following Jesus, they had heard the matchless message of Jesus. They had felt the pulse of the power of Jesus. They had been inspired by the works of Jesus. They had been made new by the Spirit of Jesus moving in their lives. Because of Jesus, these men had brighter hopes. Because of Jesus, they had deeper convictions. They had higher ideals. They had a deeper insight. But the one who had made their lives different had been betrayed. One of their own group had sold Jesus out. And then Jesus had been forsaken by the rest as they ran away. Disheartened, disappointed, dejected and crestfallen, they faced the past. And folks, as far as they were concerned, there was no future for them. As they looked at the situation, they felt that they faced an irretrievable disaster. You see, in their imperfect understanding, they had envisioned Jesus sitting on the throne of an earthly kingdom. In their mind's eye, they had seen themselves in chief places, in prominent positions in that earthly kingdom. Well, you look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you see that on several occasions they had even argued among themselves more than once about which one of them was the most important. That last night they were with Jesus, the night Jesus was betrayed, when they ate the Passover with Jesus, they actually got into an argument that night over which one of them was the greatest and which one of them was the most important. But at this point, they felt like their dream for the world's emancipation from sin was nothing but an illusion. They said, we trusted that it would have been Him that would have delivered Israel. This man was the dream they had cherished for 3 glorious years. Defeated, lost humanity was yearning for salvation. You can't really blame them. You can't really blame them for saying, we had hoped. We had hoped it would be He who would redeem Israel. When they said it almost as an undertone. Because you see, these men had gone from the mountaintops of hope to the valley of despair. They had left everything. They had left everything to follow the one who pledged deliverance from sin. And now He has seemingly disappointed them. And their last state is 10,000 times worse than the first was. It had been said of Jesus, He shall save His people from their sins. But instead they had seen the blackness of death descend upon their hope. And you think about these men. They had spent 3 years sitting at the feet of Jesus. And it's easy with us from our vantage point to be critical of them, isn't it? And we can say, well, they should have been able to keep up their faith. They should have been able to keep their courage up. Jesus had told them He was going to have to go to Jerusalem and be crucified. And over and over and over He had told them about His coming death. They just couldn't get it. They just couldn't comprehend. You see, they were still looking for an earthly kingdom, not a spiritual one. And their concept of Christ's kingdom was cast in the mold of an earthly kingdom. There had been growing opposition to Jesus. They had seen this growing opposition to Jesus. And yet they could not visualize this growing catastrophe they were facing. A catastrophe that was going to result in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Going to Jerusalem, eating the Passover, instituting the Lord's Supper we observed just a few moments ago. All of those things were links in the chain of events Jesus had tried to prepare them for. These men should have studied the prophets. If they had studied the prophets, perhaps they would have better comprehended the teachings of Jesus. They would have known He was going to have to be crucified and would rise again. But think about that. Is that not a major fault of us in this 21st century? That we don't search through the Scriptures. That we don't study the Word of God. That we don't seek to know the teachings of Jesus Christ and the teachings of God as contained in the Scriptures. We're not a lot different from them in many ways. But write this down. It's on your final exam. When things are at their worst, Christians should be at their best. And that's a lesson those men that night should have learned from Jesus Christ. There are times in all of our lives when nothing but uncompromising fidelity can keep us loyal. But in our time of greatest need, in our time of greatest despair, in those times when we are discouraged and disheartened and crestfallen, in those times, Jesus will be there. You remember the promise He made in Matthew 28? He said, I am with you always. Not part of the time. Not some of the time. Not every now and then. I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. Those disciples that night that had spent 3 years with Jesus, they should have known that. They should have remembered that experience on the sea when the little boat was tossed by the winds and the waves. And they woke Jesus up and they said, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And He rebuked the winds and the sea was calm. They should have remembered the power of Jesus when He calmed the sea that night. Huge with that little boy's sack lunch of 5 barley loaves and a couple of small fish. They knew the power of Jesus. They had been with Him for 3 years. They had watched Him heal the sick, raise the dead, made the blind to see, the deaf to hear, and the lame to walk. But their faith weakened. But they should have taken counsel of their faith and not their fears. Our fears, folks, are something that we should never consult. If those disciples of Jesus had consulted their faith instead of their fears, they would have been filled with confidence. They would have remembered Jesus was going to rise on the 3rd day. And here in our text in Luke, we have Cleopas and his companion on their way back to Emmaus. Jesus is walking with them. And tragically, they are so blinded by doubt, so blinded by fears, they don't even recognize Jesus as He walks along the road with them. They don't recognize it's Jesus until they stop at their humble little home and they sit down to eat. And Jesus offers thanks for the meal. And then their eyes are opened and they realize it's Jesus. Hope was born out of despair. Luke has told us in Luke 24 and verse 15, in the beginning of this little story, that Jesus drew near to them and walked with them. And then they realized things weren't as bad as they seemed. You know what? They seldom are. Sometimes for us things seem as black as midnight. And sometimes we find ourselves bruised and battered and at the end of our rope. But we look up to God and we pray. And we fan the embers of our faith, and it's then the Lord lifts us up to new heights. My friends, there is always more than one way to view a situation. Watch the news reports, look at the situation of our nation today, and we might look at the situation of our nation until despair just envelops us and completely overwhelms us. If you listen to some of the news reports and talking heads, we're living under a fascist dictatorship worse than the Nazi regime of Germany, and all of us are doomed. And if by some miracle we survive this fascist political regime, it's not going to be any good because global warming is going to melt everything. Walk outside, tell me about global warming. But it's going to bring about the end of life as we've known it on this earth in probably the next 10 or 12 years, if not sooner. Some of us in this room are old enough to remember then when the so-called climate experts were predicting a new ice age. How many of you remember years ago when the climate experts were predicting another ice age? I remember that. Well, that didn't work, so we got to have global warming. I hope I live long enough. I can't wait to see what the next crisis is going to be. If we survive all of this, if we survive this political regime, if we survive global warming, if we survive the coming ice age, we've still got to listen to endless political speeches, press conferences, and political pundits. That's almost enough to make you wish global warming would bring things to an end. But with all of our trials, all of our problems, and all of our challenges, things could be incomparably worse. Think of what would happen to us as a nation if radical anti-Christian elements take control of this country. Think what it might be like if we were someday deprived of the freedom to assemble and worship as we are this morning. Think of having our liberties taken away from us. In recent weeks, we have seen a group of godless heathens interrupt a religious service in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And if they get away with it, folks, that's only the beginning. We need to realize something. The freedom we enjoy in this country was a costly thing. And the rights we enjoy were expensive privileges. The freedom we enjoy, the rights we take for granted, could not be purchased with silver and gold. They were much more costly than that. Ask the colonists. Ask Washington and the men at Valley Forge. You listening? It was Washington who said, someday, when men don't have to risk their lives for it, this freedom will seem an easy thing. But when we think things are bad for us as a nation, just like those disciples of Jesus that night, we need to realize things could be worse for us as a nation, just as things could have been worse for those disciples. Neither individuals nor nations fall because of hard times. They fall. They fail when they play around the flesh pots and lounge on beds of ease. That was the sickening case with great Babylon of old. Rome decayed and was destroyed in the days of overfed ease. Our nation was built on great ideals and heroic sacrifices. And it was dauntless courage that faced the perils of an uncharted Atlantic. Our nation was not built by cheap politicians looking forward to the next election. It was built by the courage of people who faced haunting poverty, starvation, and sickness. We need a revival of that kind of courageous spirit in our country today. We need a revival of that kind of courageous spirit in the Lord's church today, folks. That's what we need. We need a revival of a courageous spirit among the people of God. We need a heavenly bonfire down inside of us, putting us on fire for the Lord. And that's what those disciples needed. Those disciples were in a storm in life. It seemed like things were at their lowest. Things were at their worst. It seemed like there was no hope. And what did Dr. Luke say? Dr. Luke said, Jesus went with them. Jesus was there. Have we not all, at some point in our Christian experience, had Jesus go with us in dark and lonely hours? Times of trouble. Times of trouble in our personal lives. Times of trouble in our life as a nation. Times of trouble in our life as a church. Times of trouble or a platform where Jesus Christ can stand and serve to strengthen us. If we belong to Christ, we can trust Him. If Jesus Christ is Lord and Master of our lives, we can trust Him. If we belong to Christ, we must be obedient to His will. And if Jesus is not Lord and Master of all of your life, He's not Lord and Master at all in your life. But when we're obedient to Him, when we're living His kind of life, when Jesus Christ is the Lord and Master of all of our lives, then when our hopes are broken, He'll fix it. When our hopes are broken, we can trust Jesus. Darkness may surround us. Night may come into our life. The stars can be punched out. Midday can turn to midnight. But if Jesus is the Lord of our lives, Jesus can change our night into morning. But to do that, He's got to be Lord of our lives. And we make Him Lord of our lives by coming to Him in simple, trusting faith. Repenting of everything that's sin in our life, confessing His name, and being buried in the water of baptism for the remission of past sins. That makes us Christians, nothing more, nothing less, nothing else, and then we belong to Jesus. I don't know what's going on in your world. I don't know what's going on in your life. Are there changes that need to be made for Jesus to be the Lord and Master of all of your life? Can we help you make those changes? This is your opportunity to let us do that.